Hi, I'm Steve Stedman, a member of the Board of Directors of the Western Sonoma County Historical Society and a docent here at our museum. We're talking today with Frank Baumgardner, author and historian, and also our Society Vice President, about his new book, which is Golden Dreams, True Stories of Adventure in the California Gold Rush. Afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah.
Goodness.
As a writer and historian, what drew you to this topic?
Well, it's kind of a long story. There's a coincidence to one of the characters in one of the miners, actually, who came from Lancaster, Ohio. And it just happened that when I was a kid, my father worked for a big glass corporation. He was transferred to Lancaster, Ohio. And I was 11 years old in the 4th grade, and I was studying, we were studying the class of, the gold rush and the westward movement of the whole country, of course. And it always fascinated me because I could never figure out what made people pick up and move. They're like sometimes their whole families or sometimes separately, like most of these 12 miners that are in this book. Did it separately. They left their families wherever home was and lit out for California. And once you went on that trail or on that ship around the Horn, you were committed. There was no way back. So it was do or die kind of situation.
Well, all this happened over 170 years ago.
Right.
And those people, of course, are gone now. So how can we come to know about this directly?
Well, this is the thing, and it's hard to find sources because a lot of the accounts or the diaries that were written by the miners years ago, they were done by presses that are no longer in business, and a lot of those books have disappeared from libraries. So I found that my best source was an antique bookstore that's in San Francisco called the Argonaut Bookstore. And they have a wide selection of many books, many of them, very valuable books too, by the way, ranging in price to $4,000 or $5,000 for rare books that are in great condition. But I'm not a collector. I was just buying the books for the knowledge to see what was in them. So that's pretty much what this book is these accounts. There's 12 of them in here. And you're right, it was 8 generations or 8.5 generations from where we are now, but it was a very different time than where the California we live now, obviously, is very different than then.
So what drove the folks that are in your book to come to California? What made them think that that's the thing to do?
There was, the first gold discovery, of course, was in Kelowna, and James Marshall was the head of a group. They were building a sawmill, and you can go, he was working for John Sutter, and you can still visit that site along the American River. And so gold was discovered in January of 1848, which was kind of a coincidence because that was actually the same month that the United States and Mexico concluded the Mexican War. And of course, we all know what happened as a result of that. California became a territory that was owned entirely by the United States. So there was the opportunity, and then there was people would read about these people getting rich out here because in the weeks and months after that first discovery, there were many more discoveries that were made. And so you suddenly had hundreds, then thousands of people deserting their livelihoods and giving up what they were doing, whatever they were doing. The crewmen of the ships in San Francisco Harbor, that there was a forest of masts because all those crewmen just got up and left. And so it was a craze. It was gold fever, they called it.
Mhm.
And it reached everywhere because anyone who could read a newspaper, they could find out what was going on. And at first it seemed like it was going to be, well, you know, just phony baloney, you know. It couldn't be, it was too good to be true, or so it seemed. And yet the reports kept coming in of more and more, you know, it didn't go away. Weeks and months went by and there were more discoveries made and a lot more people were getting, or not a lot, but a good number were getting a large take or a large pile of gold, which they could go home with.
All right. Now, how did most folks get out here?
Well, there were two methods, basically, Steve. One was to go around the Horn, which was the longest way, and that, of course, would anywhere from 6 to 8 months to go all the distance around, you know, and it wasn't easy because if you've ever seen the movie Master and Commander, you know what it was like going around the Horn, because as soon as you got past because you had the Andes Mountains that were like a windbreak, and so when you got beyond that point of South America on a sailing ship, man, all of a sudden it was just like a hurricane, because there was nothing, you know, the winds came all the way across the Southern Pacific. So, and you know, usually it was pretty cold down there too. And so, like in the book, one of the character that's in the book, Nelson Kingsley, who was from Connecticut, and when they came around the Horn, their mainmast snapped in half.
Wow.
So they had to jerry-rig it and then limp into port in southern Chile to get repairs. So that, you know, that was sort of almost typical of what happened. It was a pretty rough go. The other way, of course, is across the plains, and that was no picnic either, because you were exposed to diseases like cholera or diphtheria or malaria, all kinds of things that you could be alive one day and then gone the next. And so there were a lot of graves right along the Oregon Trail for, you know, of miners or potential miners, gold seekers who didn't make it. And so those were the two main methods, but then there were alterations of that. There was a route across Panama, another one across Nicaragua, where you take a ship from New York or New Orleans and, you know, go and come back, and then get on another ship on the other side and sail up to San Francisco. So that's pretty much how it worked.
So we had a whole lot of folks come out here. Did many of them really get rich?
Yeah, and that's the sad part. And actually, there's a story of Edward Prime, who was from Wisconsin, and in his diary, he described it as a wild goose chase. Okay. He spent about 2 years out here, and he really didn't do too well. And somehow he was able to get home again, and well, at the very least, it was good stories. And the camaraderie of the miners is what kind of makes it so exciting and much fun. Is, you know, reading about how they got along and what they did, you know, how they managed to get the gold, and they did get some. I mean, most of them got something, but they didn't. Whether it fulfilled their dreams or not was something else.
Okay. Okay, Frank, you know, a variety of colloquialisms that we have today, we owe to the 49ers. What was it to see the elephant?
Well, that was exactly the question that nobody wanted to ever see the elephant, because if you admitted, that was admitting that you were whipped. You know, you had tried everything you knew how to do, and you still hadn't struck it really rich. And you know, I think a lot of this is Nelson Kingsley, for example, who he worked really hard, 3 years or so, 2.5 anyway, in California, and was part of a company, really, that was set up in Connecticut. And, you know, he was a carpenter, a very skilled man in a lot of ways. And, but he admitted at the end, he didn't exactly see the elephant like here, but it was, you know, he admitted to himself, I'm going to have to sell out. And he sold his claim. He got less than he thought he'd get, but he had enough. He got enough money. He had, you know, he earned enough anyway from the weeks and months of the hard labor, so he was able to get home. Okay, in one piece. But yeah, I mean, that was probably more common. Definitely more common for most of them. And there's another chapter like that in here, Edward Prime, who also struggled for a number of, you know, weeks and months, and didn't strike rich, you know. So he was unhappy, but he saw the elephant, so he gave up. And that was basically what most of them had to do. And I mean, this is a side, both of those men were honest and worked hard, and they kept their money. They didn't gamble it,
Right.
you know. They didn't lose it in any other way. But they just weren't totally happy with what they got when they got home. So
See
that's
the
how
elephant.
it is.
And so, what surprises did you run into while you were researching Golden Dreams?
Quite a few, actually. One thing that happened to Israel Hale, who's, I forget which number of chapter it is, but they set off from, I think it was Council Bluffs or right around there, you know, using, you know, going in a wagon train. That's the way a lot of went. The thing that was surprising to me was how cold it went, how cold it got at night. And so they actually found that there was water, like if they had water in a pan the night before, they'd wake up the next morning and turn the pan over and they
You got frozen water in your cast iron skillet.
yeah. And so that, and then there are other things that they did. Like, for example, they would kill buffaloes just for the skin, because they would take the hides of the buffalo to make kind of like moccasins for their horses.
Okay.
Because the horses' hoofs and the oxen hoof would get really torn up along the trail. I mean, it was just really rough. And by the time they were halfway across, they were having trouble with their animals. So,
The same thing the mushers do in the Iditarod for their dogs, they make the booties.
yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
All right. So did most folks stay out here, or did they go home?
Good question. I think most of them went home. There are some examples here, though, of some who stayed and did. For example, the last chapter is Alonzo Delano, who's related several generations ago, you know, to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Right? So it's the same family. They were from upstate New York, and anyway, he was a newspaper man. When he came out here, he knew how to get by. One thing he did was he didn't have any money, and so he made portraits of some of the miners.
Okay.
He would sell his portraits. And then the thing that was interesting about him was he was the son of a doctor, and he happened to have some ointment with him. And it turned out that he won over the local chief, an Indian, who had a sore behind his ear, and he was having a lot of trouble with it. And Delano came up to him and talked to him by signs, and found out that he did have a problem. Well, he put some of the ointment on, and within a few days, the guy was much better, the chief, you know. And so he was so appreciative that they were friends, you know, the rest of their lives.
Heck of a deal.
It's quite a story.
All right. So how do you think the gold rush changed California?
Well, there were a lot of ways in which it did. There's still, I think, environmentalists. That's the unhappy part of it. Although you can't really blame that on the gold rush because that came later. I'm talking about the hydraulic mining that they would just take whole hillsides and just blast them to the point where they were leveled.
Wow.
And then they were using mining mercury for quicksilver, and that became, a secondary business. But a lot of that pollution is still in the streams and rivers of California that we're facing. It's very difficult to clean it up.
Right.
But another way in which California was changed was the Indians, because in most cases, a lot of times, the Indians did work. They were paid, in kind, either in food or, small amounts of money, to do a lot of the mining. But it didn't help them really, because in the long run, they were victims of disease and genocide and a lot of the things that were, it's sad because it didn't work out too well for them.
Yeah.
Another thing is the influence of the Chinese, because they came in such great numbers, and they were very successful, very diligent miners. And a lot of times, if a claim didn't do, if the miners didn't do too well with it, they would sell it at a discount to the Chinese. The Chinese would keep working it, and they would make it pay.
Mm-hmm.
So it was. And they had, the Chinese, generally speaking, wanted to go home if they were sick and they knew they were going to die.
Right.
So a lot of them would go home. So again, this is a story of the gold rush, is that the miners tried to, like heck, that, their goal was not to live in California by and large, because they didn't see much future for them here. And if they had wives or sweethearts, that was drawing them back home.
Okay.
And Kingsley went back home. I mean, he exchanged letters with his sweetheart throughout the whole story of his life in California. In this chapter, the last chapter, that there's 4 chapters about him. But he was a poet, and he wrote a poem about home, and it's just fascinating. But the sad part about it was when he went home, he did marry his sweetheart, and they had exchanged letters. But the sad part about it is that he died within a year after getting home, and we don't know why, because there weren't any records.
Right. But still.
Why he died.
Yeah. Well, I know it's kind of like saying, who's your favorite kid? But as you were doing the book and as you met all these people, is there one that you found really compelling?
Yeah, I think the main one is the one who he was a shoemaker, and I forget which number it is, but his last name was McNeil, and he was, the most he could have made back working, this is the problem, this is what drove a lot of them, was the fact that they were stuck in a position in a trade or in some job that was a dead-end job for them. I mean, the most he could make in a week was $1. Wow. As a shoemaker. Now, so he took the gamble to come out here. The funny thing was, he was with a group and they didn't think much of him. He had struggles with the other members of the group. There were 11 of them. And they had come down the Mississippi and, took a ship to Panama. I'm sorry, wait a minute, I'm getting mixed up. They took a ship to go to Texas or northern Mexico. And when they did, they finally got across. The first ship they got on was sinking, so they had to go back to New Orleans pretty quick. They did get to northern Mexico, but then he had a fight with the other guys in the group. And they told him, "You're never going to make it on your own. You're just one man." And he happened to have a Sharp's rifle with him, and it looked like they were going to have a duel at one point with his fellow who was a lawyer, from Columbus. And but anyway, he challenged him to the duel. The other guy kind of backed out, didn't want to do it. So he ended up getting on a ship in Mazatlan and got to San Francisco. And then at that point, he ended up going through Sacramento. He tried mining for a while. He did okay. He sent some money back to his wife in a letter, including some gold dust. But he realized he couldn't make it as a miner. And so he ended up, there was a tree on the banks in Sacramento, between the main part of town and where the wharfs were. And the ships would just come in to the wharfs. But it was a sycamore tree, and so he called his bar or restaurant the Sycamore Tree Saloon.
All right.
And he made a living at that, and there's a funny story about, he had a series of different anecdotes of guys who came into his bar. And for example, there was an Irishman who drank a lot, and usually it was fine, but at this one particular point, he challenged this other guy and went after him with a Bowie knife.
Whoa.
And as they were going out of the bar, the other guy turned around, shot him. And the Irishman made it across the river to his wife, and but a few hours later he died. And so they had a trial, but the man was found not guilty because he didn't do it. It was a matter of self-defense.
Yeah.
So it was, and then you'll see some incidents in here from a frontier of justice. And in one case, this man, this is another story he told, he stole some money from the other miners, and so they had a court trial, and the punishment in those days was pretty rough. The punishment was to have his ears cut off.
Oh.
So he had one choice, and he had one chance to ameliorate the sentence. And he said, well, if you're going to cut my ears off, and you have a doctor do it, he figured they'd do it better. And so there was a doctor who agreed to do it, and off he went. And so he was, we don't know what happened to him, because he disappeared, he stole a mule and got out of Dodge. So that story, and then the one that I like the most is there was an Illinois doctor who came into the bar. He was on his way back home. He just couldn't stand it, mining anymore. He was just sick of it. And he told McNeil, he said, if I could, I would give arsenic to Fremont and all those other letter writers who created this whole humbug about California gold.
Folks who lured us out here.
Yes, right.
All right. Well, that's really good, Frank. And again, I have read the book. It is outstanding. Golden Dreams, the stories of adventure in California Gold Rush. And I really do recommend it. It's a lot of fun. And the mere fact that my great-great-grandfather's in here, that's another
All
story.
right. We should, if there's time, I'd like to talk a little bit about him, because,
Yeah, go ahead.
all right, Robert Stedman, Steve's,
He was my great-great-grandfather.
great-grandfather.
Yeah.
And he came from Massachusetts. The family goes back to the Revolution, in fact, before that. He came out here, I think his brother went with him first time.
Yeah.
And they did well. They did really well. They went up, on the American River and, were successful, to put it that way. Then he came back home and he built a hotel and a grocery store, and he left it in charge, his wife and the family ran the store and the hotel. And meanwhile, he came back to California. He returned. He was a builder. He was a very competent builder. And the chapter's really fascinating. I enjoy it because you know, he had to find the right tools, and there weren't sawmills in those days. I mean, basically you had to work away cutting a tree until it came down, and it was a struggle. So,
Yeah, it was.
but yeah, he built a lot of farmhouses, and there was a mill in Marin County that he built, and you know, obviously his family's been successful too.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, Steve's not alone.
We stuck around.
The people who are here that are
All right.
related to the miners, so
Okay, well,
that's.
thanks for the visit.
My pleasure, thanks a lot. Okay.
Look,
Where do you get it?
yes. There it is. Now you can get this whereabouts, Frank?
Yeah, you can get it either at Amazon, I think, if they're not sold out. I heard from a relative of mine that they might be temporarily out of books, but if you keep at it, I'm sure they'll come up with more. So either Amazon or Barnes & Noble, I think, has it, or the publisher. It's a press in Indianapolis that's sort of related in some ways to Simon & Schuster. It's called Archway Publishing. And if you go online and check that out, I think you could order it direct from them.
All right.
So,
Good. It's a good read, folks. Thank you, Frank.
thank you, sir. Appreciate it.